So Noam Chomsky, at the age of 174, is still out there doing interviews nonstop. It's pretty impressive. And he was on a podcast recently. Now, forgive me, I don't know the name of this podcast, and it doesn't say it on the screen here, as you're about to see. If you know the name of the podcast, please put it in the video description box, or not the video description box, excuse me, that's my area, the comment section, so that, this person can get credit. And if you guys happen to see what podcast this is, upvote it so that it, gets to the top. Is that how it works on you? I don't even know how the comments works anymore. I mean, that's how out of the loop I am. But anyway, so Chomsky talked about Russia and Ukraine and the crisis that's ongoing over there. And he made some comments here about Donald Trump that might be him praising Trump. Let's watch and then I'll react to it.
Well, there is fortunately one statesman in the United States and Europe who has laid out, a person of a high political figure who has made a very sensible statement about how you can solve the crisis, namely by facilitating negotiations instead of undermining them, and moving towards establishing some kind of accommodation in Europe, maybe along in which there are no military alliances, but just mutual accommodation. He didn't say it, but it's something like what George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, not the second, proposed in the early 90s when after the collapse of the Soviet Union, proposed what they called a partnership for peace, which would be open for Europeans generally, Eurasians as well. It wouldn't eliminate NATO, but he would live up to the promise that NATO would not expand to the east, firm promise to Gorbachev, keep to that, allow NATO there, but kind of de-emphasize it so other countries could join, including Russia for that matter, join the partnership for peace. Tajikistan joined, for example, not NATO, and move towards a world, a Europe, Eurasia with no military alliances. Actually, de Gaulle had similar vision. Emmanuel Macron, in his initiatives trying to contact Putin, suggested something similar. So going back to the one Western statesman, he didn't mention all of this, but he suggested something similar. Move towards negotiations and diplomacy instead of escalating the war. Try to see if you can bring about an accommodation, which would be roughly along these lines. His name is Donald J. Trump.
All right, so what Chomsky is referring to here, and let me just say before I get to that, I'm sure that this is not the full context of what Chomsky said, because I think Chomsky has argued that Trump is the biggest threat in the entire world, even like a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda, for example, because, he says this is a guy who wants to make sure we have climate catastrophe, the consequences of which would be beyond dire and would destroy, civilized human life on Earth. So you can't just take this one little piece and then ignore the rest of what he says. I'm sure that the rest of what he says is incredibly vituperative and massively against Trump, so much so that, he's gotten a bunch of crap from right-wingers for making statements like, hey, Trump is a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda or whatever he said. Again, I don't know if those are the exact words that he used, but that was the spirit of what he argued. Now, what he's referring to in this particular instance is an April 18th statement from Donald Trump, 2022, and he said the following: "It doesn't make sense that Russia and Ukraine," should I do it in the Trump voice? I'll do it in the Trump voice. "It doesn't make sense that Russia and Ukraine aren't sitting down and working out some kind of an agreement. If they don't do it soon, there will be nothing left but death, destruction, and carnage. This is a war that never should have happened, but it did. The solution can never be as good as it would have been before the shooting started, but there is a solution, and it should be figured out now, not later, when everyone will be dead." Okay, so now that comment, I think there's nothing disagreeable in that. I think we need to find an off-ramp. We need to find a way out. We need to find a way to make peace. Now, it's yet to be seen that if you make a peace deal and then Putin violates it and he continues jacking countries, well, then effectively he was unappeasable, and any sort of deal with him would be like, we are Neville Chamberlain. But you have to be willing to take the chance of looking foolish, because what are the other alternatives? The other alternative is like immediately escalate to nuclear war, or immediately start World War III, or have a permanent stalemate that lasts 10 years, and then there's endless fighting and dying and carnage. So you have to be willing to try that. Not everybody who's a bad guy in history equals Adolf Hitler. So, there's a lot of different historical analogies you can pull here, but everybody goes right to World War II, Hitler, to argue that like we shouldn't have peace at all, or we shouldn't even attempt some sort of a negotiated settlement. So on this front, I totally agree with what Trump is saying. However, and I think this is a very important point that a lot of people might be missing, including Chomsky, at least in this clip. Again, I don't know the rest of what he said. I'm sure the full context is different. But Trump, at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, said we should, quote, bomb the shit out of Russia and pretend that our planes are Chinese planes in the process. So that when it happens, we get to go, I don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't us, dog. I mean, that's an absurd thing to say for so many reasons. One of the reasons is, obviously, Russia knows China's not going to bomb them because China is providing a financial lifeline to Russia. They're acting, in many ways, as allies as Russia is doing what they're doing in Ukraine. So for them to do an about-face and start bombing Russia, that wouldn't make any sense. They would know immediately that this isn't actually Chinese planes attacking us. Duh. But he floated that idea casually, like, let's start bombing Russia. Let's bomb the shit out of Russia. The other thing is, Putin has brought up nukes many times, and Trump has been saying in all of his commentary on this, in a hilarious way, might I add, that like Putin keeps using the N-word. He can't stop saying the N-word. The N-word. And by that I mean nuclear. But you know what? We can use that too. We could say we have nuclear weapons too, and we have bigger ones than you do. So in other words, his instinct is also exactly what we saw in the verbal back and forth with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, where, remember that day Trump went on Twitter and casually was like, I could bomb you into oblivion, so you better shut up. I remember that day thinking like, Jesus Christ, if there was ever a time to make the argument that, hey, I think Trump is violating Twitter's terms of service because he's almost doing a direct threat of violence here that could lead to a catastrophic war, that was the time to be like, whoa, maybe a little timeout, maybe a little suspension or something on Twitter would actually make sense in that context because it's a clear violation. Although Twitter has these weird rules of like, you can't threaten violence unless it's a state, in which case, yeah, that's called statecraft or whatever. So he's also said that. Now, another statement he put out on Russia previously was, I hope everyone is able to remember that it was me, as President of the United States, that got delinquent NATO members to start paying their dues, which amounted to hundreds of billions of dollars. There would be no NATO if I didn't act strongly and swiftly. Also, it was me that got Ukraine the very effective anti-tank busters, javelins, when the previous administration was sending blankets. Let history so note. So in other words, his argument there is Obama was weak on Russia. Obama was not willing to arm Ukraine. I stepped in and I said, I will arm Ukraine. Now, by the way, a lot of those weapons, we now know, were going to the Azov Battalion, the neo-Nazi brigade that's part of the National Guard unit of Ukraine. There was a big scandal about that when we found out that, hey, we're arming neo-Nazis. Congress cut off the funds for the arms for the neo-Nazis, but then, by the way, soon thereafter, they ended up slipping the funding back in there, so it was only temporarily that we halted it. I'm sure now a lot of the weapons are going to the Azov Battalion as well. But in other words, Trump, in many respects, was way too hawkish on the issue. Trump very famously axed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and said, I'm not going to allow that pipeline under my watch. That's the natural gas pipeline, which would have went from Russia to Germany. So, in a number of ways, he was bellicose, he was hawkish. There was a NATO buildup on Russia's border under Trump. So, now, this is what Trump does, man. And I'm sure Chomsky knows this, but at least in the context of the clip we just showed, it doesn't appear he does. Trump has a remarkable ability to say things on both sides of an argument, and people just read into it whichever side they agree with. So if you're somebody who's hawkish on the issue of Russia, you're a neocon and you want World War III, you will seize on Trump's comments about we should bomb the shit out of Russia and pretend our planes are Chinese planes. If you're more dovish and you don't want war, you can seize on the statement where Donald Trump says we need a negotiated settlement. But as a general rule, Trump as president, what he always did was defaulted to the mainstream conventional wisdom. That's always what he did. So another example of this is when he used to go out on Twitter all the time, like every half a year or so, and say like, we're going to get out of Afghanistan, we're going to do it, it's so stupid that we're there, it makes no sense. And then some general would come to the Oval Office and be like, sir, we're not going to do that. And he's like, no, you're right, we're not going to do that. That doesn't make any sense. He had some sort of deal where after he was out of office, eventually, even though we had thousands of troops there, then we would wind down. So that's what he does. He says things on both sides of an argument, and then for whatever reason, he's got a quality to him that feels authentic. So people just read into whatever he says like, oh, the thing he really believes and wants to do is the thing that I agree with. And so doves have something to cling to. Hawks have something to cling to. Another great example of this is, remember, when he was campaigning in 2016, he would say all the time, we're going to end the stupid wars. We don't need these wars. We're going to rebuild here at home. And then he also went on Fox and Friends at the same time and argued, we're going to bomb the shit out of ISIS, and we're even going to take out their families. We're going to take out their families. I remember covering that and just being like hair on fire. Like, what? Just openly arguing for massacring the family members of terrorists, which is a war crime. That would make you the terrorist. If you're purposefully killing civilians, that makes you the terrorist. So he said both things at the same time. We're going to end the wars. We got to stop doing this. It's stupid. But also, we're going to bomb the shit out of ISIS, and we're going to kill their family members. So if you're a hawk, if you're a neocon, if you're an imperialist or a war criminal, you look at that and say, oh, great, I want to bomb ISIS and bomb the family members. If you're a dove, you say, hey, he wanted to end the wars. So cool, he wants to end the wars. The reality of the situation is actions, of course, speak louder than words. So what policies is he actually pursuing? And talk is cheap. And there are some politicians who they come across as incredibly weaselly. So when they flip-flop, when they contradict themselves, when they're on both sides of the same issue, you go, you don't mean a goddamn word of what you say. But Trump somehow gets away with it because, I don't know, again, he's got that authenticity feel to him. So when he says something that people are like, oh, he means it because he said the thing I like. Yeah, but what about the time he said the opposite? So, I mean, credit on the good stuff he said, but it's not much because he's also contradicting himself every 7 seconds that he opens his mouth. So, look, there's plenty to criticize about how Biden is handling this. But I will say, my guess is if Trump was president, he would have been so afraid of looking like a bitch and looking weak if Putin invaded that I would have feared what Trump would have done in response. I think he would have started, jawing at Putin, and he would have started chest thumping, and he would have said, if you don't get out of there, we're going to make you pay for it. And because, again, we saw similar stuff with North Korea when he was in office about how, the language was very aggressive. Now, maybe the language works to make Russia back down, and then we could say, oh, look, it worked out for the better. But I don't want to take that risk. So I don't think that's the way to go. Now, in terms of how Biden's handling it, the things I agree with Biden on are the sanctions that target Putin and the Russian military and the oligarchs. But what I disagree with Biden on is, of course, the fact that the sanctions have hurt regular people in Russia. So that goes too far, in my opinion. And the other thing is, I was in favor of weapons going to Ukraine for defensive purposes. But now it's like every other week we get a story about how another $33 billion is going to Ukraine. And I'm like, how many rounds of weapons are we going to give them? And are we really vetting these weapons? Like, how do we know they're not going to the Azov Battalion? And the answer is we don't. And they probably are going to the Azov Battalion. Now, granted, the Azov Battalion is a very tiny portion of the Ukrainian military. They're a part of the National Guard. But at the same time, I'm not comfortable with any weapons going to neo-Nazis. Call me crazy. It reminds me very much of how we armed, moderate rebels in Syria who ended up being jihadists. They were part of al-Nusra Front, which is a branch of al-Qaeda. So I don't like that either. So there are things to pick apart in how Biden's handling it, but this notion that, Trump would definitely be more dovish and, reach some sort of peace agreement. Final point, another great example. He would say all the time about Israel and Palestine, about how, we need peace, we got to do, and then everything he would do would be on the side of Israel and would further increase tensions and lead to more conflict. So if your rhetoric is all about peace, but your actions continue the violence and facilitate more violence, it's hard for me to give you credit. And I think that's exactly what would have happened when it comes to Ukraine. So I think any president in this is looking at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, I think any president of the U.S. would act in a very similar way. But again, I fear it's the lack of stability from somebody like Trump that would almost scare me more. And there's stuff to criticize that Biden does, but I don't think he's as unstable as Trump is. And so my fear would be the opposite of the stupid mainstream media narrative. The mainstream media narrative, of course, is that Trump is a puppet of Russia, and so he's going to let Russia get away with whatever the hell they want to do, and he'd be too willing to get some sort of peace deal too quickly. He'd be willing to, cut Ukraine in half and give it to Russia. My fear is the opposite, that between miscommunication and massive egos, the conflict could become even worse than it is and could lead to a hot war between the West and Russia, which would be absolutely disastrous. So anyway, there's Noam Chomsky's comments. Again, it's a little misleading because everybody knows what he thinks about Trump, and he usually had 99% negative things to say about Trump. But even in the context of this, I think he's missing the fact that, unless the rest of the video contradicts this, but it looks like he's missing the fact that Trump says both things at the same time, all the time. And so to just give him credit on the positive thing, but don't bring up the negative thing, well, that's definitely misleading. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.